Okay, so let's go ahead and start. We're going to start with experimental design because the second FRQ is almost certainly going to be something involving research methods and experimental design. In fact, they've said it's a research methods based question. So most of the time, that means it's an experimental design question. Every once in a while, they might have a scatter plot there or other things like that, but I can go over some of that stuff. I think some of you chose that anyway. So, excuse me, you want to conduct an experiment. First thing you need is you need a hypothesis or you need a theory before anything else. Once you've got your theory, which is I think that everyone who laughs for an hour a day will be happier in the long run. Then you need to make a hypothesis. Your hypothesis is going to be measurable, or it should be measurable when you when you connect it to your different variables, your measurement tools. So that's like saying the more people, uh, those people that laugh an hour a day will experience higher rates of happiness. Makes it more clinical. You can measure that because you can measure a rate of happiness. You can measure the hour of laughing a day. That's your hypothesis. You can also have your null hypothesis. Your null hypothesis, or the H kind of to the zero, is when we make the opposite of the hypothesis. That way, if we prove the opposite of our hypothesis, it still counts as it being correct. So, for example, if you say those people that laugh for an hour a day will score better on a happiness survey or a happiness questionnaire, then you can say that those people who laugh an hour a day will score lower on that happiness questionnaire. If you prove that, then that's just as good because, again, you're proving something related to your hypothesis. Even if it rejects your original theory, it's just as good. So then you've got your hypothesis. Now you need to go with your sampling. You've got to start off first with your population. Population is anybody who's eligible for your experiment. So if you're talking about all people, then that could be your population. If you say the population that I'm going to use will be adults from Fairfield, then that's still representative of everybody. That will still work as well. From there, you've got your population, and you choose a specific number of people within that larger sample size. If you've got all the people in Fairfield, you may choose 1,000 of them. And that's going to be your population itself. That's the population of your experiment. Uh, and and then what you're going to want to do, and you want to randomly select with experimental design to make it the strongest. Random selection has to occur. That way, you don't have a sampling bias where you have all sorts of different people within your experiment: men, women, rich, poor, young, old, etc., etc., etc. So that's your random selection. You're randomly selecting 1,000 out of that larger population, and then your and then those are your participants for your experiment, for example. From there, now you need to split them up into two groups. You've got your control group, and the control group is the group where nothing changes. So if this was an experiment of those people laughing an hour a day will score higher on will show more to be happiness or to have more happiness, then the control group will not laugh for an hour a day because that's not the change that you're looking for. So your control group is the group where nothing changes. Your experimental group, on the other hand, is the group that experiences the change of your experiment or what you're trying to test in the first place. When you're doing this, random assignment is key. And I'll get into that a little bit further. But random assignment is key, again, to avoid a sampling bias where you have a representative sample of all types of people in each of the two groups. That way, when we look at confounding variables, it's going to have more of an impact. And I'll talk more about that in a second. So now you've got your two groups, experimental and control. From there, you carry out the experiment. In the experiment, you're going to have two variables. You're going to have your independent variable and your dependent variable. Your independent variable is the variable that is the change. So, for example, one group is laughing for an hour. That's the experimental group. One group isn't. That's the control group. That's your independent variable right now. It's the change, the thing that you're testing within the experiment. It's independent of everything else. Then you have your dependent variable, and your dependent variable is your measurement tool. Everybody in your experiment gets it from both groups. And when you do that, you are basically measuring kind of what the independent variable is supposed to do. So laughing is supposed to increase happiness. Well, then you have a way to measure happiness, a survey, a questionnaire, observation, etc. And from there, then you collect your data. Now, other things that could be part of the experiment too is you've got confounding variables. Confounding variables are all those extra things that make a difference in the overall results of your experiment. So, for example, if this was you laugh more, you're happier, well, the amount of sleep you got might be a confounding variable. Now, the reason why we do random assignment between the control and the experimental group is because by doing so, you reduce the effects of the confounding variables. If you have a person in each group who didn't get good sleep the night before the experiment, then certainly it's still representative because they each experience the same thing. If you get two people who did experience good sleep, one in each group, then again, it's going to be equal. And we know that the difference in the results is not from the confounding variable, but instead it's from the independent variable, the one that you're testing. In certain cases, you want to have a single blind study. A single blind study is when the participants don't know if they're in the control or experimental group. Drug studies, for example, is a really good example of this. And then a double-blind study would be if you, not only the participants, but also the researcher doesn't know who is in which group. Again, it's meant to eliminate bias. If you don't know what group you're in, you're just going through the experiment and the results will basically speak for themselves. So that's experimental design. That's from the start kind of to the finish. Anybody have any questions?
Yeah. So for the FRQ, if it's experimental design, would it be asking us? Is that just asking us to design the experiment? I don't know if that's a dumb question.
No. It's a very good question. So it'll be something more like, at least what it has been in the past. It'll be like, they give you what the person is trying to do in their experiment, and then they'll be like, operationally define the independent variable, for example. Will be one of its bullet points. Or like, how would you make sure that confounding variables aren't? So it's anything connected to the design of the experiment. So no, you wouldn't have to write it out. At least in most cases, it's been more like, what would the state what the hypothesis would be based on the scenario that they're giving you. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome. Anybody else have anything about experimental design? It's only a 15-minute FRQ, so I'm guessing that it's not going to be super big. But again, who knows? So, I wanted to make sure that you guys got everything involving experimental design. All right, now let's go ahead and take a look at some of the other things that you guys have requested. We are going to start with one that almost everybody requested, and that's p-scores and z-scores. These are really simple, actually. P-scores and z-scores are two statistical measurements based on the data that you get from your experiment. The z-score is the number of standard deviations that any data point is from the mean. So if you have your normal bell curve, say, you got your like this, and you got your mean down the center, then you've got your standard deviation split up. If it's a normal bell curve, we know exactly how it should be split up. But other times, the standard deviations might be different, but they're never going to ask you to calculate standard deviation. They will just say, like, maybe if they do ask something involving it, it'll be like standard deviation is 3. So if you've got a data point that's 9 away from the mean, then that has a z-score of 3. Because if they've got a standard deviation of 3 and your data point is 9 away from the mean, then that's 3 and 3 and 3. So that's 3 standard deviations, and then that would be your z-score. That could be 9 above the mean, also 9 below the mean too. So that's your z-score. Your p-score is the score that determines whether or not your experiment is statistically significant. For psychology, we want that p-score to be less than 0.05. basically, here's what that means. The p-score, or the higher the number of the p-score, then the more the results of the experiment is based on confounding variables, based on other things that are a part of it. But if we have a p-score of less than 0.05, that means less than 5% of our results are determined by confounding variables, by other things, rather than what we're trying to test. And if that's the case, then we can say that it's statistically significant. So that's p-scores and z-scores. All right. Let's see. Some of the other ones. The 3 early schools of psychology. All right. I'm going to guess that they're not going to ask this on the AP test, but you never know. So I'll cover it very quickly. We've got structuralism, functionalism, and behaviorism. These are the 3 early schools. Structuralism was started by Titchener along with Wilhelm Wundt, and that was to identify the structure of a person's thought process. So what they did for structuralism was, after completing a task, they had the person reflect on how did they think through that task, to understand the structure of the thought itself. So that's structuralism. Functionalism, William James is the key guy for this one. And functionalism is basically not what is the structure of the thought, but how does this thought, or how does this behavior, or how does this thing that a human does, any behavior, any sort of thing, any thought, how does this contribute to the overall survivability of humans as a species? So think like Darwin and evolution. That's where William James was really studying things. And what Darwin looked at is he looked at physical traits, like, does a bird have wings that can make them fly? And how will that affect their overall survivability as a species? Well, what William James did is he said, I want to look at human behaviors and human thoughts and figure out how those things contribute to humans surviving as a species, to humans thriving as a species, and so on. So what the overall function of each thought and behavior. And then finally, you have behaviorism. John Watson is the main guy for this one. And that's basically, we want to look at the actions of individuals and not the thoughts of the individuals. So we want to look at how do the actions change, how do environmental effects affect the actions and the behaviors, and so on. Those are the 3 early schools. 7 perspectives. Okay. They could ask 7 perspectives, and it's certainly a good thing to know, because honestly, you can fit everything from the class into these 7 perspectives. And if you can do that, then when it comes time to recall that information, if you know what perspective it's related to, already you've made it easier on yourself. So we always remember the hand mnemonic. So we start with our thumb. That's psychoanalytic because we're looking behind us. Then we've got our index finger. We tap our head. That's cognitive. Then we've got the middle finger, and that's behavioral, because the way we behave when we see that finger certainly has been conditioned. The ring finger is humanistic, because you need assistance from others to keep it down or to keep it up. And then finally, you have pinky in the brain. That would be biological. Then you've got the 6th finger for evolutionary. And then finally, all the fingers together for sociocultural. And those are the different perspectives, different ways of explaining human behavior and human thought and human actions and so on. There's generally an explanation from each of the 7 perspectives for any sort of behavior that you can come up with. All right. Let's see. Experiments and quasi-experiments. I'm glad that some people asked about these. Experiments are very simple. I went through experimental design already. Basically, you've got your control and experimental group, independent and dependent variables, and things like that. A quasi-experiment has an independent and dependent variable. The difference between a quasi-experiment and a normal experiment is the lack of random assignment. What that means is that, let's say you are doing an experiment where you say, if girls got this and boys got that, or if girls got this and boys got the same thing, then there's going to be more an effect for girls or more of an effect for boys. Well, certainly you could make those your 2 groups, and your 2 groups could be measured the same way. But in that, one, if you did it with the exact same thing happening to both group, you don't have a control group, because at that point, it's not a difference. The only difference is their gender. The other thing is that the gender effects, or the other, whatever the group is, could have an effect on the overall results. So that it doesn't just include gender, it could include any group of people. But if you define it in saying it's this group of people against that group of people, then it's not a true experiment, because you're not doing random assignment. And a lot of times you also don't have a control as well, because each group gets the same thing. And you're trying to look at the differences between the two. So that's really the difference between an experiment and a quasi-experiment. Okay, scatter plots and correlation coefficients. Okay, so correlation coefficient basically means that two things are correlated together. The closer they are to 1 and -1, the stronger the correlation is. So like the strongest correlation would be like 0.99 for a positive correlation, or negative 0.99 for a negative correlation. Anything over a correlation of 1, a correlation of 1 is perfect, but it's impossible. Anything over a correlation of 1 is not correlated. So that's where you get the range of the correlation coefficients. Now, if it's positive, the slope shows it as going up from the bottom, and then usually kind of up higher as the numbers increase on the scatter plot. Can't really show that on the on the Zoom call. If I had a board, I would draw it. But I think you guys can understand what I'm saying. If not, just look up what a positive and negative correlation looks like on the scatter plot. But that basically, a positive correlation is when both variables either go up at the same time. So the increase of one variable causes the increase of another, or the decrease of one variable causes the decrease of another. The negative correlation, the slope starts at the top at kind of at 0 and then heads downwards. And for a negative correlation, that's when one variable increases but the other variable decreases. So, for example, if you were comparing the effects of the amount of sleep or the amount of sleep deprivation on overall school success, for example, you could say that the less sleep deprivation you have, the better your grades will be. And that would be a negatively correlated experiment right there, or research. All right. That is it in terms of the ones that more than one person asked about. Is there anything else from research methods that anybody would like me to cover or just touch on that they find is very pressing? If not, I'll start getting into the next stuff. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and switch gears. We're going to take a look at cognitive psychology. There's not a whole lot here that people want me to discuss, thankfully. That means that I did my job relatively well. But again, if you do need me to cover anything, by all means, I will. So we'll start with the information processing model, which is basically that big kind of flow chart about how the process of memory works. Essentially, you've got you start off by encoding information in, and then you've got your sensory memory. Your sensory memory lasts 2 to 4 seconds. But then when you pay attention to the information, then it'll go to your short-term memory. Your short-term memory can hold 7 to 9 chunks for about 15 seconds or so. And then with rehearsal and maintenance, we go into storage. Storage puts it into our long-term memory. Our long-term memory is infinite, and we can remember things forever if we have enough practice. And then when we need to retrieve it, we use that information from our long-term memory as part of our working memory. And our working memory is a form of short-term memory that we're using in that moment to access to solve a problem or think about a solution or think about something. That's the information processing model as a whole. it kind of looks like a weird little flow chart. Basically, it's just meant to show kind of how step by step how the whole process of memory works. All right, the next one, implicit and explicit memory and where they're located. Okay, so implicit memory, sometimes it's also called procedural memory. Implicit memory or procedural memory is memory of skills, memory of physical skills, anything that involves coordination and balance. So like, for example, walking or driving a car or writing with a pencil or things like that. Anything that is physical, that it has like a form of muscle memory. That information is stored in our cerebellum because that's the part of the brain that deals with coordination and balance. Explicit memory or declarative memory is memory of facts. And those memories are stored in our hippocampus, the brain's main memory center. And then also you have episodic memories. Episodic memories can be connected to the amygdala as well because of their pull on the emotions and how they kind of elicit emotional response. All right, let's see what else. All right, the availability and representativeness heuristics. If I just had to guess of things that would be on the test from cognitive psych, I think these two have a good chance of being on there. They're asked often. So these heuristics are problem solving techniques where we use kind of rule of thumbs and shortcuts and mental shortcuts and assumptions in order to solve problems faster, in order to not have to exercise and go through every single step-by-step possibility the way you would with an algorithm. So, but with the availability and representativeness heuristic, sometimes it shows that our assumptions are wrong. The availability heuristic is when we make assumptions based on the information that we have at hand. And so that means that we're only using the information that we have in front of us or in our heads, that we have kind of heard from somewhere else or from someone else. Why this might be wrong is because that means we're not using that other information. We hear about people being attacked by sharks. I actually know there was someone who got killed by a shark attack like last week in Santa Cruz. So that example is not perfect these days. But even so, not many people get attacked by sharks, but you hear about it a lot because it's sensational. You don't hear about all those people who go into the ocean and swim and don't get attacked by sharks. So that makes shark attacks seem much more frequent than they actually are. So that's the availability heuristic. The representativeness heuristic is when we use our own personal stereotypes, our prototypes and stereotypes, to make the assumption about people or about things. Like if you saw someone who was dressed in a leather jacket and ripped jeans, would you guess that they're a banker or a bartender? You'd probably guess bartender based on your own personal stereotypes and prototypes about what a bartender should look like and what a banker should look like. But that person could be a banker. You never know. So that's the representativeness heuristic, again, where we use our own personal prototypes and stereotypes, our representations of concepts to make assumptions. But sometimes our representations are wrong. Okay. And then the last one from cognitive psych that people have is the linguistic relativity theory. This one was a big one. So the linguistic relativity theory, the guy's name is Benjamin Whorf, spelled with an H, so WHORF. I touched on it very, very briefly. It involves language. And the linguistic relativity theory basically says that the culture that we're in determines how we assign words. So how we assign words to concepts, to objects, to actions, and so on is based on our culture. And so if there is an action, let's say, that's not part of our culture, we don't have a word for it, but other cultures might, because their cultural values have led to conceptualizing that with a word where other cultures may not. And that's just the linguistic relativity theory. All right, that covers all the ones that had more than one person asking from cognitive psych. Anybody have anything from cognitive psych that's still pressing that they want covered? By all means, please speak up if you need something. All right. I'm going to go into personality and intelligence. That'll be the last one. If there's something from any of the three units that you're like thinking about it, you're like, wait, I really don't know what that is. By all means, today is a good day to ask because it's the last review session. So let's go ahead and take a look at personality and intelligence. So the psychoanalytic theory of personality involves the id, the ego, and the superego. Think about it this way. The id is the devil on your shoulder. The id is that unconscious influence of all of like your raw primal things. Freud would always say that it was violent and sexual, probably both, because that's Freud, who Freud was, and he was a weirdo. So he said, there's your id. It's your unconscious side of your brain. It's the part that you can't control, the part that has primal urges. And then you've got your super ego, and your super ego is the angel sitting on your shoulder. That's your ideal self. That's your overall ideals, the best person that you want to be, the one that you know is the correct thing overall. The ego is the part that's rooted in reality, and where the ego attempts to satisfy the urges of the id while maintaining the ideals of the superego. So if the ego or if the id wants to kill somebody and the ego said killing is wrong, we might yell at them instead because then it's socially acceptable and it's something that we know doesn't violate our ethical principles, our ideals. So it's a ways to still kind of release the overall like rage that the id might have. That's the id, ego, and superego. Pretty sure people are going to want defense mechanisms. All right, there's a whole bunch of defense mechanisms. I'm going to go through them as fast as possible, and I may leave one or two out because I don't have them in a list in front of me, but I try to remember all of them. All right, so we've got projection. And projection is when we accuse somebody else of doing that thing that's causing us anxiety. And anxiety occurs when the id and ego, or when the ego can't resolve the dispute between the id and the superego. That's what Freud says gives us anxiety. The way we cope with anxiety is defense mechanisms. When we project, we're accusing somebody else of doing that thing that's causing us anxiety. So cheating on a significant other, you accuse them of cheating on you. Displacement is where we take out our frustration on someone who's less threatening. So like when a parent yells at a child, for example, or when a big sibling yells at beats up a little sibling, even though they haven't done anything really wrong, they're taking out that frustration on them. We've got reaction formation, and reaction formation is when we outwardly express the opposite of how we're actually feeling. So if I'm feeling angry, I'm just going to keep smiling, and it's very happy. Obviously, not exactly how I'm truly feeling. You've got sublimation. Sublimation is when we turn our negative behavior into a kind of positive, worthwhile behavior. We've got identification, and identification is when somebody is doing something to us that causes anxiety. We begin to take on that person's or those individuals' characteristics. We've got repression, and repression is when we bury the memory deep down so far that we can't remember it, and therefore it doesn't bother us anymore. We know that repression actually isn't real. We've got denial. It's when we refuse to accept that anxiety-inducing thing is happening to us. We've got rationalization, and rationalization is when we attempt to explain our own anxiety-inducing behavior when we say like, oh, it's because of this or because of that. Or even if someone else is doing something causing you anxiety, you say, oh, it's because they're like this or because they're like that. That would be rationalization. I think I covered everyone. Is there any one that people still need? I didn't have a list in front of me, but I'm pretty sure I hit them all. Is there anyone people remember that maybe I didn't cover? I think that was it. Okay, I'm sorry. There's so many of them that I tend to forget if I don't have the list. Okay, the next one is reciprocal determinism. Reciprocal determinism is Bandura's theory of personality. Basically, he was saying that, and this is a social cognitive theory of personality. Um, Basically, what Bandura was saying is that we've got three distinct things: one, two, three, like a triangle. You might remember that. Three distinct things that make up who we are. We've got our behaviors, we've got our environment, and the environment can also include the people in our environment, the people that populate it. Um, and then we have the personal and cognitive factors. And that includes things like temperament, it includes things like personality traits, it includes things like our overall thought process and so on. Basically, what he's saying is that these three things all connect and they all influence one another. So our personal and cognitive factors are going to influence our behavior and influence our environment. But our environment will also influence how we think and also how we act. And then how we act will influence how we think, but then also influence our overall environment. Basically, making it that everything is reciprocal. They all affect one another. And those are the three factors that really make it what it is. All right, Carl Rogers and his theory of self. All right, that was the big one. That was the one that had lots of information, if you remember that lecture. Basically, this is humanistic theory of personality, where everyone's trying to achieve self-actualization. But if they don't achieve self-actualization on their own, they need assistance from others to get it. And there are three distinct things that they need to get, need to have in order for that to occur. One is unconditional positive regard. So judgment-free overall acceptance. Oh gosh, I'm blanking. It happens occasionally. Let's see. Sorry. It's embarrassing. The other two things were genuineness. So a person needs to be open and honest, even when it sometimes hurts. But they need to do that while having unconditional positive regard. And then empathy. They need to be able to feel how you're feeling. And if a person can do that, then they can assist you in getting to self-actualization. And that's really the key. And once a person does that and gets to self-actualization, where their ideal self-image matches their actual self-image, then Rogers is saying that they're a fully functioning individual in which they've kind of got to self-actualization, or they're really close, and their overall ideal of their selves, or what they feel like they should be, matches what they actually are. And if not, then obviously a person still has work to do, and they can still get assistance from people within their overall environment. I apologize for the delay on that one. I literally just blanked. It happens to everybody. Actually, that was the last one that people were asking about within here. All the other ones just had one vote. Okay, so we covered personality and intelligence. We covered research methods, including experimental design, and we covered cognitive psych today. Does anybody have any questions about any of those three topics? Things that I might have covered that maybe you just didn't get, or any other concepts that are connected to that? No? Okay. Well, if you have any questions, and I'll post this on Classroom for everybody, so even if you're watching a recording of this, if you have any questions, like you're doing some last minute studying, you get to a concept and you really just don't get it, please feel free to email me. I will have a check-in on Tuesday, and I'll have that. Normally, it would just be for my second period class. I'm going to open it up to everybody in AP Psych because the test is later that day on Tuesday, and I'll probably open up a check-in to everybody on Wednesday if you want to talk about the exam or whatever. So hopefully you study well. Hopefully this has helped. And again, please don't hesitate to ask me any questions or email me or anything else if you're preparing and there's something that you still don't get.